Hey everyone, and welcome back to another installment of Learn to Program. So in the last video we talked about writing, our very first couple of Python programs, and we learned how to produce basic output to our command prompt and do basic math such as addition and division and things like that, which can really be pretty useful to us. So as you might recall, I kind of left off with this funny example of what happens when we tried to add the number 54 with the letter A. And we got an error, and of course it makes sense to us because intrinsically we already know that it's, I guess, not possible to add a number in a letter. But the question is, how does the computer know that? And so in this video we're going to kind of expand on that and talk about data types as well as an introduction to using variables. So I guess in short, I'll start out by saying that every value in a computer program is stored as a data type. So for example, 54 would be stored as a number, and this would be stored as a character. So the computer already knows that these values are not possible to be added together. So we'll kind of talk a little bit more about that. I guess I'll start out by giving a list of some common data types that most computer programs make use of. So we'll just kind of quickly go through these here. Integers are basically just your basic counting values when you think of 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on and so forth. Those are all integers, and of course that includes some negative numbers as well, and of course 0. So any negative integer, 0, and positive integer, they're all stored internally by the computer program as an integer data type. So moving on down the list here, we've got floating point values. And floating point values are essentially real numbers, so numbers with decimal values. As soon as a decimal point is added to a number, even if it's just a 0.0, it's still stored internally as a float. So an example here being 4.0, the computer would read that as a floating point value. So characters are single units of text, I guess in the simplest way to describe it. They're usually surrounded by single quotes. So digits, letters, and special characters can all be stored as characters with the use of single quotes. So even this 5 here, which you would consider as being an integer, but because it's surrounded by these quotes, it becomes a character. So expanding on the characters, we've got strings, which are basically just a list of characters, or like a sequence of characters. Think words and sentences as opposed to just single letters. So strings are usually surrounded by double quotes. And just as kind of an important aside, note with the characters and strings, there are certain characters that cannot be expressed in characters or strings just the way you would see them. So, a good example being the backslash, which if you were to store a backslash in a character, you couldn't do just a quote backslash quote. You'd actually have to put 2 backslashes in there, and it's tricky to explain why for the time being, but just something to keep in mind. We'll get more into what's called escape characters in the future. So moving on down here, Boolean values are basically just logic values containing true or false. So nothing too complicated about these ones, but these values are extremely useful in larger programs where you might only want the computer to do a certain part of the program if a certain value is true, for example. So and then I guess one of the more complex data types is what's called a list. So we'll definitely get more into that in some future videos, but the basic idea is that you can have a list of values, such as a list containing 1, 2, 3, 4, or A, B, C, and things like that. But we'll get more into that later. So when we kind of go back to this program here, and we tried running it in the previous episode, we'll go ahead and try that again. So Python first program.py. And so now the error might make a little bit more sense. We get a thing called type error, unsupported operand type for int and str, which basically means integer and string. So it's basically the computer understanding that we've got a number here and a text value here. So it's a little bit important to kind of realize that you just can't do those kinds of things when you're programming. So let's kind of talk about some of the basic operations we can do with, at least as far as numbers are concerned. So I've got another little table here. So anytime you're working with numbers in a computer program, you'll often want to do some basic operations. So we already kind of did addition and division yesterday, but of course you can do subtraction, and there's a special star character here for multiplication. And there's some more down here. You can do two of those little stars can be the exponent, and this percent sign here, which is called a modulo, pretty much acts like a remainder. I think there's a few cases where it doesn't act like a remainder, but in most cases you'll find that's what it does. So we'll talk more about that later, but those are some basic operations you can do. And again, there's plenty more built-in operations you can do on data types. In the description of the video, I'll kind of link you to, I guess, an exhaustive and complete list of what all you can do with it. So I guess now that we've covered some of the basic data types, let's get into talking about variables a little bit. So in general, it's very useful to store values in variables that can be used throughout your program. So instead of just writing a bunch of different values in your program and not really knowing what they do throughout the program, we can name these values and use that name wherever we want. So for example, I can store a value of the string data type into the variable called name. So we'll go ahead and try that now. So I'm going to create a variable here called name, and I will set that variable equal to my name, which is John. And then I'll go ahead and write another line down here saying print name. So I'll go ahead and save that. Now, what does name equals John tell the computer? Well, it tells the computer to create a unit of storage, for lack of a better phrase, and to fill that unit of storage with a string with the value of John. So now whenever we reference that storage unit in our program, for example, print name, so we're referencing that variable, the computer will locate that variable and pull out the associated value. So we're going to go ahead and run this and see what happens. So I'll pop open my command prompt and we'll type in Python first program.py. I guess this is really not our first program, so maybe I should eventually save this as something else, but for now it'll do. So we'll go ahead and run that, and of course it prints out my name. So cool. So let's see what happens when we change the value of name, maybe underneath that or something. So I've already named it John, but let's maybe decide that I want to change my name to Andrew or something similar. So we've got that name there, and we're going to kind of copy the line that we had below that first one, and we'll kind of print name again, and let's see what happens. So we'll go ahead and run this again, Python first program.py, and look at that. So it prints my name, and then I go and change the value of name, and it'll print the new value, which is Andrew. So since we changed the value of the name, the computer was able to pull out the new value, even though print name is still technically doing the exact same thing. So just to kind of note, it's really important to have meaningful variable names in your program. As you're going along and writing your program, it could very well be tempting to just quickly create short variable names such as A, B, C, so on and so forth. But in large programs, it becomes very, very difficult to keep track of what certain things mean and what certain things are doing. So meaningful names like name, for example, will make it easy for anyone who looks at the program to understand. So I guess we'll kind of quickly talk about in Python there's a standard naming convention used. All variables should be lowercase, and separate, I guess, words in the variable name should be separated by an underscore. So for example, if I wanted to create a variable called first name, it might look something like this. So we'll do first underscore name, and I'll write that as John, and then maybe last name would look something like this. Last name equals Martin. And I forgot to add the second quote there, but the point stands. So that's just kind of the general naming convention you'll want to use throughout your Python programs. So that kind of covers most of the content in this lesson. Hopefully by now you should have a pretty good understanding of what the different basic data types are for computer programs, as well as kind of how to basically just store certain values into variable names. So I guess if you want practice using these concepts, I've created a brief little program, like practice program, you can write if you'd like. So go ahead and read through this. This is probably a pretty useful little exercise in seeing if you really understand data types and basic output and how to store things in variables. So I'll let you go ahead and read this, and in the next episode we'll kind of expand more on variables and get into basic control flow type stuff. So thanks very much for watching, and stay tuned for the next episode.